Apologies for the shitty lighting, but it is winter and we are in Wales, so this is what we've got to deal with. It feels like I've not been on BookTube in ages. You probably haven't noticed my absence, why would you? But it has been well over a week since I uploaded a video, and it has been over 2 weeks since I filmed one. The day before Christmas Eve, so the 23rd, Christmas Eve, I planned on having a big filming day and having loads of videos ready that would carry me over the Christmas and New Year period, because I knew I would be really busy with Christmas stuff, and then I knew I was going to be working a lot after Christmas. But on the 23rd I was actually called into work, so I didn't have time to film anything. I had Christmas Day and St. Stephen's Day off, or as it's called here in the UK, Boxing Day. I had those 2 days off, and then I was straight back into work. I had 8 days in a row. For most of those days, I think like all but 1.5, I was managing the whole store while the sales were going on, while scanning all of our stock rooms to find sale stuff. And it was really mentally and physically demanding, and I was starting at like 8 o'clock in the morning and finishing at 6 o'clock, and by then it was really dark and I just didn't have the energy to film and I didn't have the light to film. But now I finally got a few days off and here we are. I'm going to talk about my top 10 books of 2017. Actually, I should probably talk about what qualifies something to be my favourite book of a year. This list is in absolutely no particular order, and I'm still not sure if I do have an absolute favourite book of the year. But for something to make it onto this list, it has to be a book that I really enjoyed the process of reading. It has to be something that I wanted to come back to again and again. It was something that I didn't want to put down. It's normally something that I learned something from, or something that I saw myself in, or both. Although normally when you see yourself in a book, you usually realise something about yourself and then you get really existential, and that's the shit I crave. It has to be something that has stayed with me. It has to be something that I'm still thinking about months, if not years later. And obviously I don't know if I'm going to be thinking about these books years later, but for a lot of them, I'm definitely thinking about them months later. And it has to be something that I know I want to reread. Also, can we look at this mug that I got for Christmas from my friends? They're the best, and I love this so much. Also, I hope you had a good Christmas and a Happy New Year. Anyway, these are the books. I'm going to start off with talking about 3 poetry collections that I loved in 2017. The first of which is You Sad Feminist by Megan Beach. Meg is amazing, and I have the utter privilege of considering her one of my friends now. She's a phenomenal person and a phenomenal poet. I absolutely loved her first collection, When I Grow Up I Want to Be Like Mary Beard. I adored it, I thought it was amazing. And this second collection is just as incredible. It carries on a lot of the themes from Meg's first collection. We have a lot to do with feminism and politics, what it's like to live under a conservative government when your beliefs don't align with that. It has a lot to do with what it's like to be a woman, about activism. But also incorporated into You Sad Feminist is very personal touches about Meg's experiences with depression. And that struggle of wanting to change the world when some days you can barely get out of bed. Quite topically, my womb is killing me right now. Meg has a really powerful, like, slam poetry style of voice, and that definitely comes through in her collection. I think if you want to listen to her poetry, that's a great choice, but it's also just as brilliant on the page, which I think is a real talent. She's clever, she's insightful, she's witty, she has this ability to put feelings that you've had but not been able to articulate. She has an ability to put those feelings into words. And at so many points when I was reading You Sad Feminist, I was like, yes, that's how I feel. She's awesome, her collection is awesome, and I can highly recommend it. From these next 2 poetry collections, you can probably decipher what kind of poetry I'm into, but the next collection I'm going to talk about is Let Them Eat Chaos by Tempest, and I listened to this right at the start of the year. I listened to it on Spotify, which I can highly recommend, and then I got a physical copy from the library and actually read the words, and both experiences were really, really great. And again, the poetry works when you listen to it, but it's not weaker on the page by any means. Sometimes you can get that with kind of slam spoken word style poetry, that it does rely a lot on the sound effects and how something just sounds cool, but it doesn't have a lot of depth to it. And what I really love about all 3 of the collections that made it into my top books of 2017 is that they're not weaker on the page by any means. Anyway, Let Them Eat Chaos is about one street in England, and it is about all the different things that are going on in that street, but it also has this underlying political element, and it has a lot to do with Brexit and the divisions in this country. I don't know a single person who has read this and not loved it, and I think if you want to listen to it, it's a really great way to get into poetry if you're not sure if it's for you. But yeah, Let Them Eat Chaos, it's amazing. It is one of the 3 books that I had was it 3 books or 2 books that were in my top books of the year so far that I did around June time. I'll link that down below if you're interested in seeing how the lists differ. And the final poetry collection I'm going to talk about is Plum by Holly McNish. Holly McNish is a wonderful poet whose career I have followed for the past few years now, and I think she's phenomenal. Plum is really interesting because it has this wonderful juxtaposition of poems that Holly wrote quite a long time ago, poems from her childhood and adolescence, and she sort of has a bit of commentary on those poems and what they mean to her, but she's also written new poems in response to them. It's really interesting to see her progression of a poet, and it's a really annoying thing as a poet to see how wonderful she was when she was just like 16. I think if you are someone who writes poetry, this is a really interesting book to look at. If you don't write poetry, it's just really interesting to see someone's progression, both in terms of their art but also their beliefs and understanding of the world. This is one that I really want to reread, and again, there were so many moments in this where I was like, yes, she has articulated that thing that I've experienced as well. Next we are on to the novels. I don't have most of these books actually with me. If I've already read a book, I tend to leave it in my mum's house, so most of my books on my actual shelves in my room are unread books, which is always awkward when someone comes around and they're like, oh, have you read this? Have you read this? And you're like, no, I've not read any of these books. But anyway, the first novel I'm going to talk about is Little Fires Everywhere by Celeste Ng. I did do a full review of this book, and I will leave that linked down below as well if you're interested, but this is a phenomenal book from, I think, one of the most important voices in American fiction at the moment. So this book is set in a small American town called Shaker Heights, which is actually where the author is from. This is kind of like the stereotypical perfect American small town. Everything's very plain, everyone sticks to the rules, everyone has a very nuclear, middle-class white family, and that is really encompassed by the Richardson family. But at the start of the book we learn that the youngest Richardson child has burned their house down. That's the opening of the book, them looking at their house burning down and knowing it was the youngest sibling. But then we go back in time to the arrival of the Warren family. The Warren family is made up of single mother and artist Mia Warren and her daughter Pearl. They are renting a property from the Richardson family, and they form different kinds of bonds and friendships between the two families, but the Richardson mother discovers that something doesn't seem quite right in the Warrens' past and begins to dig into Mia's history, and she discovers a lot of things that could be viewed as scandalous. Another storyline that we have going on in this book is that of the custody battle over a Chinese baby who was abandoned by her mother when she was struggling to cope. A white family in Shaker Heights is trying to adopt this baby. Now that the biological mother is back on her feet, she definitely feels more equipped to take care of her child. There were so many things that I found fascinating about this book. It had so much to do with the complexities of that custody battle and what responsibilities a white family would have in adopting a Chinese baby, and how more often than not the white families are ignorant of these responsibilities. This book was a complete page turner. It is so complex. The characters are crafted so well. They are really flawed, like all of them, and even when they do actions that could be immoral, you can really see their justification for it and how it makes sense to them. And I think the characters in this were just crafted wonderfully, and it dealt with so many interesting themes. As I said, I will link my full review down below if you're interested in hearing more of my thoughts, but yes, this book was amazing. The next book I wanted to talk about was The Glorious Heresies by Lisa McInerney. This is a book that is set in County Cork in Ireland, and it has a lot to do with gang culture. It has a lot to do with the violence of the country, and I think that's what I really loved about this book. It follows a whole host of characters, which is something that I always really love, and I'm always really impressed when a book can do that, when an author is able to balance so many different characters really well. That's something that I also loved about Little Fires Everywhere. The Glorious Heresies begins with a murder, how that murder is covered up, and we follow these whole host of characters, some that know, some that don't. It has so much to do with the relationships between different kinds of people. Lisa McInerney is wonderful at dialogue. She really captures the accents without it being confusing. I'm pretty sure it's not confusing for anyone that isn't familiar with an Irish accent, but it's still like transports you into the place. I was really impressed by that. I'm always so impressed when an author is able to do strong dialogue, and I think if you are looking for a book that doesn't paint Ireland as a rolling green hills and actually has a critical and interesting depiction of the country, then I would highly recommend The Glorious Heresies. The next book I want to talk about is The Cows by Dawn O'Porter. It wasn't a book that created that much buzz on BookTube, which it surprises me. And I know a lot of people that didn't like this book, but I loved it. I loved Donna Porter. And a few years ago, I discovered her YA duology, Goose and Paper Aeroplanes, and I loved those books. So when I found out she was writing a adult fiction piece, I was so excited and I immediately requested a review copy. So this book is about 3 different women and how their lives intersect. It has a lot to do with motherhood and feminism. It has a lot to do with grief. It has a lot to do with relationships. So we have one character who is a documentary filmmaker. She's a single mother and she goes out on a date. The date is amazing, but afterwards she loses her phone and she's unable to get in contact with this guy, and also she is the victim of a national scandal where her privacy is really invaded. Her face is on like all the news stations, all the newspapers, and it's about how that affects her life. We have another character who is a very well-known like feminist blogger, and she very publicly says that she doesn't want to have children, and she faces a lot of backlash because of that. And it also puts a huge amount of strain on her relationship with her own mother. And our final protagonist is a woman who is dealing with the fact that she has lost both her mother and her sister to cancer, and she too will have to go through preventative surgery to ensure that she doesn't have this cancer as well. And that means that she only has a year to have a child, and it follows the lengths that she will go to in order to make this happen. Again, this is a book where the characters are really complex and they're really flawed, and even when they take immoral actions, you can understand their justification for them. All of these women's lives become interwoven and they intersect, another thing that I really appreciate. And how that is done really seamlessly and effectively. This book also made me question my own opinions on a lot of things, on a lot of feminist issues, which is something that I thought was really great. And ultimately, this is about women who do not follow the herd, and I just really loved this book. It's definitely one that I would like to reread. Next, I have a couple of YA books. The first of those is The Hate U Give by Angie Thomas. This is a YA book about the Black Lives Matter movement. It is set in America and it follows a teenage girl named Star who is drawn to activism after she witnesses the murder of one of her best friends by a police officer. It's about how that incident affects Star's life on a very personal level, but also on a broader political level, but also how for her those things are the same. They can't be separated. I thought it was really great to see a really healthy family environment for Star. Both of her parents are really supportive of her, they really care about her. And on the theme of political elements being inseparable from Star's personal life, it looks at how race intersects with everything in her life. It intersects with her in school because she's one of the few black kids at her school. It looks at how some people in her life really don't understand race relations and why they're important. It looks at the challenges she faces in having a white boyfriend. I just really think this is a phenomenal book. It is brilliantly written. It is about such an important subject matter. It's incredibly accessible, and I would recommend this to anyone, young adult or otherwise. The next YA book deals with kind of similar themes, and that is My Sister Lives on the Mantelpiece by Annabelle Pitcher. This is a book about a young boy whose parents are going through a separation and he doesn't really understand what's going on there. He has 2 older twin sisters, but one of his sisters has passed away, and we learn that this was a result of a terrorist attack in London. So we look at how that grief has affected the whole family, and we see how in the father in particular it has led to a lot of unjustified prejudices. Our young protagonist begins to form a friendship with a Muslim girl in his new class at his new school, and we see him working through the prejudices that he has absorbed from his father and working out that they're unjustified. And we see him hiding this friendship from his father. Like, this kid has constantly been told throughout his life, the Muslims killed your sister. And he's working through that toxic message. I think this is a really important book. I think it is a book that would really be of benefit on school curriculums, particularly in the UK. This was a really surprising book for me. It wasn't something that I anticipated loving this much. The final 2 books that I'm going to talk about are both non-fiction, and they both have a lot to do with gender. The first of those I'm going to talk about is How Not to Be a Boy by Robert Webb. I wasn't sure if I wanted to put this on my top books list because I think the one thing it isn't checking off for me is that I'm not sure if I'd want to reread this, But if Robert Webb wrote a follow-up book, I would definitely read it. And it was a book that on every page I was thinking, this book is really good. I love this book. This book is great. Robert Webb is a comedian or comedic actor. You may know him from some of his work with David Mitchell, like the Mitchell and Webb Look or Peep Show. I've always really liked his comedy, so I was really excited and surprised when I found out that he was writing a book about gender. This is a book about toxic masculinity and how masculinity can affect men really negatively. It looks at the pressures men face to behave in a certain way. It looks at how men are so often told to man up, which essentially means bottle up your feelings and don't talk about them, which leads to the fact that there is a massively high suicide rate among young men. And Robert Webb analyses all those things in relation to his own life and reflects on how that negative, toxic masculinity has had such a profound effect on his life. And he's very self-reflective and self-critical, but I think in a very positive way, in a very productive way. It goes right from his childhood up to his adult life, although I feel like we missed out a lot of stuff from his adult life. So as I said, if Robert Webb were to write a follow-up book, I would really enjoy that and I would definitely pick it up. We look at the grief that Robert experienced when he lost his mother. We look at his relationship with his father and his brothers. We look at his romantic relationships and his understanding of his own sexuality. We look at his school life and how he struggled to get into Cambridge. He really wanted to get into Cambridge so he could join the Cambridge Footlights, a really prestigious and well-known comedy group. And I didn't actually know this, but Robert Webb did an English degree, and his love and admiration for literature really comes through in this book. I think if you are someone that enjoys reading about gender, then you will really enjoy this. If you are someone that really enjoys books that reference other works of literature, then you will really appreciate a lot of this book. But I also think casual readers that want to understand a lot more about masculinity will really benefit from this book. And the final book I want to talk about, and probably if I had to pick a favourite book of the year, I think it would be this one, and I read it right at the start of the year. It is Girls Will Be Girls by Emer O'Toole. This is a non-fiction book that analyses gender and its performative nature, how we perform these roles of masculine and feminine, why we perform them, what happens when we decide to perform them differently. And while it is a book that deals with a lot of complex theories, it's really, really accessible. Emer O'Toole has a wonderful way of explaining concept, theories, and ideas in a really accessible way. And I think she predominantly does that through anecdotes. That's what is making this book so accessible. She tells the stories of her own performance of gender and how people have reacted to her when she's done kind of like little gender performance experiments. This book is really funny as well. Like, she's so witty. A lot of the time when I pick up non-fiction books about gender, I find them a little bit basic for me. I don't want to say basic. I find that a lot of the ideas in them are already familiar to me. Whereas this book, it didn't have that at all. It didn't feel like something that I had already read. But at the same time, I think it would also be really accessible for someone who hasn't read a lot about gender. So they were my top 10 books of 2017, and do let me know if you've read any of these and what you thought of them. 2017 was a bit of a funny old reading year for me. I think in 2016 I read a lot more favourite books. I didn't do a top 10 books of 2016 video, and I feel like I really should have, because there were so many books that I read in that year that I still consider some of my favourites. Books like The Museum of You by Cara Spray, Nina Is Not Okay by Shappi Khorsandi, The Tidal Zone by Sarah Moss, Middlemarch by George Eliot. There were just so many brilliant books that I read in that year. And I'm not saying the books that I read in 2017 weren't brilliant. I loved all of the books that I spoke about in this video. But I'm not sure how many of them would be like, oh my god, these are my favourite books ever. Which is fine. I guess 2017 was just a bit of a strange year for me in general. Like, a lot of stuff happened. A lot of stuff. That's all I'm going to talk about today. I hope you're having a wonderful new year, and best of luck with your reading in 2018. I will talk to you guys in my next video.